This morning's session is going to ground us in the problems that we all face in our private, professional, and public life when it comes to privacy. Our first speaker, for many of you, will need no introduction. You will all be acutely familiar with his work. For those of you that aren't familiar with him, let me introduce him quickly. He first came to prominence as a law student, where he successfully challenged how Facebook was handling his private data. This resulted in the invalidation of the EU-US Safe Harbor Privacy Shield. He is a lawyer, founder of noyb.eu. He is a digital privacy activist and advocate. Please join me in welcoming on stage Mr. Max Schrems.
Thank you. Cool. I was asked to kind of give a bit of a background story as an intro. We later have an interview anyways, but maybe you heard the one or two bigger cases, but maybe we can zoom out a bit and look into what we all do. A bit of a background on my end. I really started looking into privacy more here. High school in the middle of nowhere in Florida, where I was in high school exchange when I was 16. As an Austrian, where there's no CCTV cameras at your school, where there is no grade books, where everything is a number, and where you as a student do not even have a number, you suddenly end up in a 2,000 people high school, literally in the middle of nowhere, that actually had a whole police force there, and everything had to be reported. You had grades that were in percentages and so on, and to even go to the internet, your parents had to sign a waiver, which I think for my getting that done with Austrian parents took a month until I could finally access the internet at high school. So it's a bit of a different world, and you then realize how culturally a lot of these privacy feelings are different. I later had an exchange in California at a small private university with a similar experience. From all of that, I actually made an access request with Facebook, which was kind of the first act way before any of the data transfer discussions. And the interesting part was that Facebook at the time, not being overly organized, actually sent me all the deleted data, all the stuff they shouldn't have anymore, right to my doorstep. And that was actually the starting point where there was a feeling of, okay, some of these big tech companies may actually not have their house in order all that much. You can actually see there it says, for example, deleted true, so stuff just being flagged as deleted and you get it right back. To my surprise, I put some of that online. I thought maybe some researcher is going to be interested in having that information. And a couple of weeks later, all of that was on the front pages of the news in Europe, even the biggest boulevard newspaper in Germany up there. And suddenly you became that public figure that you actually didn't really want to be honest. But it was a time where a lot of that was kind of rather new. And we had then these, that's at the Court of Justice, where it basically won these data transfer cases, and you end up suddenly being on crazy CNN and kind of talk about all these privacy stuff. Now, that a bit on my background story. If we zoom out, and maybe as an intro for the whole conference, what we are really interested in at noyb as well is this kind of intersection of technology on the one hand, where we now have suddenly all new possibilities that we didn't have before, and on the other side, that idea of privacy. And if we talk about privacy, it's usually quite useful to think about what we really mean with privacy. It's usually this buzzword that we all use 100 times. But one thing that I always try to do is to think about it as two different levels of privacy. We do have that first level of just feeling surveilled. And that's, to be honest, in the complaints we get, for example, as a nonprofit organization, the bigger part of where people complain. It's not necessarily the actual misuse of your personal data, but just that feeling of, oh, they have all that stuff on me, I don't feel that's overly comfortable. And a good way of thinking about that is the idea of a panopticon. That's these prisons that they built where there was just one prison guard in this tower in the middle, but all the 1,000 cells felt under surveillance, even though no one watched them ever. But it changed their behavior, it changed their freedom and their options to kind of really freely express them or whatever they wanted to do. That is the first part of privacy, and oftentimes the one that may change our society more than even the actual data use we have in the background. Obviously, we then have the actual abuse in the sense that, or use of data in the sense of, for example, being denied credit. If some credit ranking agency has a wrong entry, we got all these complaints as well. But the first part, I think, is oftentimes the more interesting one because it's about a freedom. And freedom is a non-tangible airy idea, and it's something that we can have a lot of disagreement about because it's not something that logically you can always explain, and a big part of privacy is something you cannot logically explain. There are parts that are logic in the sense that if, for example, you are on public record, usually people have less of a freedom of speech and say less. That may be good or bad. If we think about hate speech online, maybe it may be good to not be always anonymous in different ways. Very different political views on that. Another one that is very logical is, for example, how there is the privacy in the voting booth. That's even in all our constitutions usually, because we know people vote differently in that voting booth than before. To give you an example, in Austria, since the 90s, we have right-wing populism, and we know that people do not poll. Like, if they're called and asked, are you voting for this party? They're like, no, I would never. And then in the privacy of the voting booth, suddenly this goes up 10%. I remember when there was the Hillary-Trump election, everybody expected Hillary to be voted for, and the whole US was surprised that people didn't poll for Trump. As a learned Austrian, you're like, yep, we have that since 20 years, and our pollsters already know that you have kind of upped the right-wing party a little bit. So that's stuff where it's kind of logical. But there are things that are not overly logical. For example, if you think about sexuality or kind of relationships, that is something that we feel is very private, but there is no logical reason for that. I usually say you could theoretically have sex on the street or right on this stage. People generally don't do that because we have an agreement that this is a private matter, but it's not logical. There is no logical reason for that. Dogs do not agree with this logic. It's a human logic, apparently. But we have to accept that it's there, and that may be also a bit different per culture. One study that I read a while ago that was just amazing is they measured how long it takes people to pee in a pissoir. Men take about 10 seconds longer if another person is in the room. Logic of that, I don't know, but it is something with someone else is watching me. So there are these elements of privacy that we have to accept, even though we may not fully understand why it's there. But that's part of a democracy that partly it's just the way that people are. Other parts that we are obviously very interested in is how the information age changes power dynamics. If we're saying, information is the new oil or all this kind of like buzzwords, we all know that in any kind of gamble, it's a huge part of what do you know about the other side. If you discuss with your employer how much you should actually get next year, knowing that they actually don't have anybody else would probably give you the upper hand in that discussion. On the other hand, if you know that actually they have 3 other people lining up, you may not be that aggressive in your demands. And this information, for example, may not be available to you, but may be available to the other side. And how much we shift information back and forth can fundamentally change the dynamics in a society. There are these ideas that were floated, for example, that airlines would give you a ticket price not just on when you fly and so on, but on your personal ID. And for example, for me, I go to conferences, someone else pays my flight ticket. They could probably charge whatever they want because I already agreed I'm there, I'm already in the program. What are they gonna do? Are they really gonna kick me off the program because the flight ticket is too expensive? Probably not. Otherwise, if you're someone that wouldn't go there anyways because they don't have much to do, the price would probably change. And that would totally change, for example, this whole industry sector if that information would be available or not available. And that is largely regulated, for example, by the GDPR. What I already touched on a couple of times is the cultural element. As far as I know, people from very different backgrounds are in this room. And the cultural element of privacy, I think, is oftentimes underdeveloped a bit. If we think about the first case that was out by the US Supreme Court, it was about phone tapping. And there was a wonderful sentence in it, it's from the 20s, where they say the wires, because basically in the US as a background, the protection is of the house and the effects. And the question was, how much is a telephone line part of the house? And there was one sentence in this long, long judgment saying wires are not part of the house or office any more than the highways along which they are stretched. So the understanding was no privacy whatsoever in anything you talk into one of these like modern machines that make sounds come out a mile away. And that was actually the law of the land until the 60s where they reversed that. On the other hand, for example, the German Supreme Court, very much the other end, where really even like the counting of people for statistical purposes was already something where they saw some privacy issues. The really interesting part is we now have this interconnected world where really data flows across all these borders and cultural lines. And even within Europe, when we had the negotiations around the GDPR, it was really interesting how there was a totally different view, for example, from Scandinavia of like perfect transparency, I can see the tax returns of my neighbor, versus like countries where there's a very different view of how private stuff should be or not. And that is partly where we work on now also on the data transfers. We're just having these different cultures all regulate all these spaces. And we had a first time where there was no regulation whatsoever. It was the Wild Wild West. Now we are in the second phase where basically everything gets regulated and really a new law comes out every half a year. And we'll have to move on to a third phase of how to reconcile that, how to come to international agreements or at least regional agreements, so to say, so that there's larger spaces where you can actually work on things like that. As I mentioned, a lot of that has to do with power in our view. So we also see some of these laws as a type of informational redistribution, as I would call it. So we have in a capitalistic society the idea of redistributing wealth via taxes, via social benefits, and so on. And you can think about some of these rights also as a redistribution in information age. For example, that right to privacy may limit how much the bigger guys, so to say, can invade your own informational sphere. On the other hand, something like a right to access, for example, can, in the other way around, the transparency rules, make sure that governments or big tech companies have to be more open about what they're doing and actually be more transparent on their end. And that can shift some of these power dynamics towards something that may be more balanced in the long run. We're at the very beginning of all of this. If you think about the transition for I missed the word. The Industrial Revolution, we are probably 10 years in, and we're now 200 years later still debating how far workers' rights should go. So all of this is going to be an ongoing debate, but some of these elements could even out some of the changes that we have in society with these new technologies. Now, zooming in a bit on solutions, this whole room is probably more equipped to talk about technical solutions than I am, because I have my little programming lessons, but I'm a lawyer, and the technical side is really something that we look as lawyers to as well to find solutions. So I think it's very interesting to go into that if you think about different encryptions and so on. What we see as a problem is this idea of educating people. We see that a lot in kind of every interview I have with every newspaper is how can we educate people to make informed decisions. We are of the view that in reality this is too complex to get an informed decision by the average consumer. People work 10 hours a day with 100 other problems, and other than the people in this room and a couple of other rooms, no one the fuck cares about any of this. And to be honest, no one should care about it, because we also don't care about hygiene laws, or I don't know if anybody checked the building code before getting into this building to make sure that this doesn't collapse on our head. We just assume someone else in our society took care of that. And that is, I think, to a certain extent what our role should be as privacy experts, but also as the people on the technical side, solving these things, to make sure we build products that people can trust without having to worry and read 1,000 pages of privacy policies, which no one does anyways. So we think this educational idea is useful, that people get a general understanding of the problem, but to a large extent right now it's still this responsibility shifting idea of saying this old grandma should have read all the details of the privacy policy, and if she didn't, it was her fault. And we're not really convinced that that is moving anything forward in any way. Kind of the next step is the California approach, or the classical US approach of notice and choice. So there's not just this notice part of transparency and telling people, because we're transparent now it's your fault. There should also be some choice element. And the US does that a lot. There is a lot of US law that basically follows the notice and choice principle. It's typically something we don't do that much in Europe. We usually have more of government tells you what to do and not to do than this notice and choice idea. A wonderful idea of how to think about notice and choice is, who has ever been to California knows that there's 1,000 labels about anything that could be cancerous. I don't know if anybody has been to California, they're all over the place. It's Prop 65, where under some law they actually have to put that on. Now, it's basically the idea telling you this product could be cancerous, and then your option is to, accept it or fuck off. That's basically the two options you have. And it goes so far that this is even on fucking Disneyland in California, that this whole Disneyland could be cancerous. This is kind of what we do with privacy policies. We kind of have a very, very lengthy disclaimer, and then tell people, take it or leave it, which is not really where we think in the long run this is going to solve anything. Now, we in Europe basically have this idea of consent, which In a liberal society, we must have, I think, because everybody can give up their right to life, for example, so you can jump off the bridge, and that's your free choice in a liberal society. So you can also jump off the bridge in your privacy world and just give up your right to privacy. That's where a lot of the consent comes from. Usually, no one would actually click on that button if it's jump off the bridge OK. So we usually know that we kind of rephrase that and say, oh, jump off a cliff in the sunset and click OK, which is kind of where the UX designers are very happy to do all that. But that's something that we actually probably have as a choice model in Europe. Now, if we go into the right of privacy itself, we interestingly have that to basically stay. I think all our jobs is very much guaranteed because we have Article 7 and 8 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is part of the EU treaties. And unless all the member states get together and have a 100% vote to get rid of this Article 8 here, the GDPR is pretty much going to stay the way it is. Because what's really interesting about Article 8 is it defines a lot of the elements of the GDPR explicitly, like purpose limitation, like having consent and so on, which is different than other fundamental rights. So actually the legislator has very little wiggle room to kind of do something else than at least the core principles of the GDPR. To be honest, a lot of the red tape they could probably get rid of tomorrow, and I wouldn't even have a big problem with that. But the core rules we're probably going to have for a good time. What's interesting as well is it, however, got talked down as like a bit this kind of crazy law that you don't really have to comply and it's all kind of complicated. What I just want to reiterate sometimes is when the GDPR was negotiated and actually voted on, more than 90% of the European Parliament voted on this law in favor, which hardly we ever have for any law. And all the member states actually voted for it. So from a political or democratic side, it has huge backing. In the business sector, in a lot of the conferences we're at, that backing sounds oftentimes a bit different, but I think it's important to remember that from a democratic process, this thing is actually having that backing in reality. Now, our biggest problem in reality is enforcement. So we do have all these laws in Europe, and we're wonderful and wonderfully great in passing another and another and another law and be the champions of all fundamental rights usually. But what we have an issue with is enforcement in the European Union. That's basically where we come in as an organization. One of the favorite stickers that we have is breaking the law is not innovative, because usually this idea comes around of, oh, if we just say we're modern and novel and it's AI, or it used to be blockchain, or I think Google Glasses at some point, then we don't have to follow any of these rules. Being in this business now for 15 years, usually the law succeeded at some point and was more of a question of how long it was dragged out. But we still see that actually the compliance rate is rather low. We ask 1,000 data protection officers within companies of how much they think there is compliance, and there's tons of numbers. You can find the whole study on our website. But one of the most interesting ones is 74% said that if a DPA, a data protection authority, would walk into the door of an average controller tomorrow, they would surely find relevant GDPR violations. If you ask the same thing to a fire officer and you're like, if you would walk into a normal building, how many fire problems would you, like relevant fire problems would you find? And 74% of them would say, yeah, sure. I'm not sure how mature this industry is so far, and this part of our governance structure is so far. And that's people actually working on that. So probably their perception may be a bit different than the full numbers. So I think there is still a lot of work to do. Obviously, where we go to the most is the DPAs. This was the most famous picture I think we ever took of the Irish Data Protection Commissioner at the time. That's a supermarket. This was the commissioner. And at the time, they actually regulated, I think, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Twitter, LinkedIn, pretty much anybody. Since this picture was around, they got a fancy new office in Dublin. But the background is still very much the same, that we do have cases where, Ireland is a good example of that, where 99% of the complaints are actually handled by basically throwing them away, because there is never a decision on the complaint anyways. And that is a big problem that we in reality have. We have these laws, but the enforcement is really lacking. Part of the reason is that the DPAs are officially independent of the executive. So basically, the executive cannot order the DPA to do anything. And that's a wonderful way, because a justice minister can just put someone there, not going to do anything for 8 years. And if they're asked, they can say, oh, I'm very sorry that Helen didn't feel like doing it, because she's independent. I can't order her to do anything. And that is a structure that in all the member states is really a problem. There's usually no legislative oversight. The judiciary is oftentimes blocked just by cost. So bringing a case in Ireland costs around 100,000 euros if you go to the High Court. No average person actually has that money. We do as a nonprofit organization, and even for us, we're struggling. Other countries, it's much easier. Like my home country in Austria, it's 30 euros to go to the court, so a bit of a different ballpark. But there is a big block for the judiciary. And on average in Europe, it's about 2,000 to 5,000 euros to appeal. So you have a free complaint, but if you actually want to get your free complaint and you don't get it, you pay 5,000 euros to get your free complaint. So the question is how much that is really free after all. And last but not least, media and public can usually be a bit of an element. And we see tendencies where now with especially confidentiality arguments, all of these procedures become suddenly dark procedures where no one is allowed to talk about anything. We actually had in this jurisdiction, I think a year ago, an amendment to the Data Protection Act that we called it Lex noyb, that basically makes talking about procedures a criminal offense. So potentially, if we talk too much, next time I come to Dublin Airport, someone may await me. We'll see how that works. But that is where we see that this enforcement part gets gradually isolated. So at a certain point, these authorities, if they don't want to do it, they may not do it because they're isolated from all the appeals that you have around. That is not a specific problem to any kind of specific jurisdiction. If we look at our cases, we run more than 800. The gray cases here is all the cases that are basically waiting for a decision, and that goes up to 4 years and longer. So that is the reality of a lot of these cases if they go. Luckily, if we actually get a decision, we're usually in the green, so we usually win our cases, but the delay is a big issue. Now, there is talks about that there is all these wonderful fines. The only fine that we witnessed that was ever paid was actually 50 million euros for Google in France, where we were involved. 50 million for Google, probably not a big problem. There are these fines that we hear in the media. For example, there was this record fine of 1.2 billion against Meta. But the reality is all of them are on appeal. Nothing of that was ever paid as far as we know. So a lot of them are paper enforcement, but not really anything that's paid in the end. One of our favorite ones was the Article 61A, 61B. That was basically a question of Meta actually having a legal basis to process data for advertisement. This is roughly the advertisement revenue they made in the relevant time. We don't know if all of that was based on personalized advertisement, but probably a big part. So there's a bit of a gray area here where we don't know if it's all personalized advertisement that actually falls under this. This is the maximum fine under the GDPR that could have been enforced. So you already see whatever they did, they made more money than paying even the highest fine potentially under the GDPR. This was the imposed fine. They didn't even go to the maximum. So the reality is that even these fines that sound like huge million amounts of dollars or euros are not really catching up with the violations that we have in the background. Now, obviously, we can go to the courts, but in reality, most of the courts are super expensive to go to. Most judges don't want to deal with A, technology, and B, GDPR, so they are very happy to get rid of the case in some way. So that is where basically the NGOs come in. We're this nonprofit organization. We're largely funded by about 5,000 donors. And we have all these different cases that we bring. Obviously, the data transfer ones are the ones that are more known. But we also have situations around, for example, pay or okay that more countries introduce where you have to pay unless you actually want to consent to things. We did have larger cases in Germany, for example, against political parties that used sensitive data to target, so micro-targeting to actually manipulate elections. There's a good part on credit scoring and credit ranking, which is extremely different per member state. Some countries do not even have that. Some countries, it's omnipresent. There are little cases that are interesting, like, for example, a payment provider in Germany that basically had all the products you bought in the API. And we had one complainant that bought stuff at a sex shop and at a pharmacy, so you could literally see each item that was bought in the sex shop in the payment processing part, which was absolutely irrelevant to kind of process the payment. We're now going a little bit into the whole AI discussion. That's still very much at the starting point. And what's really interesting looking forward on how to kind of get enforcement done, one thing we heavily invest is digital enforcement to automate the enforcement of all of this. Most of the enforcement is still done literally like that. Like even in countries where you have to file electronically, they print it off and put it in a cabinet. So on our end, we actually build software. We can automatically detect violations on websites, for example, automatically send complaints and actually make a much more efficient enforcement structure here. Most of that, we actually try to agree with the companies up front to say, okay, that was not right, let's fix it, and we just throw away the complaint and we all pretend all of this didn't happen. That worked in the first round for 42% of the companies. So that was for us really interesting because we could actually get the enforcement much more efficient just bilaterally talking to a company than doing any of the DPA stuff. What was also interesting is that generated a load of domino effects in the sense that we scanned about 5,000 pages for one of the projects. We only sent emails to about 500 of them. After the summer, we're going to continue with the rest. Most of them were suddenly compliant because people talked to each other and said, oh, you use the same software? That's upcoming. You're a larger website. You're going to get one of these. And there was automatic compliance before we even asked anybody. And that was really interesting how these types of enforcement, for example, really worked. Last but not least, I think what's not on the radar of people, but what's going to probably define the enforcement part in the next years is collective redress. So the EU has passed kind of a European class action law, and the GDPR is explicitly one of the elements where you can sue under. And it's really interesting because the Court of Justice has a nuanced, but I think stable approach to non-material damages. So usually if you have 1 million people that were affected by a data breach or by some other violation, they may not get a lot of money, but if it's 100 each and you have 1 million people, that's 100 million euros. So that can actually become quite interesting as an enforcement angle. What you do there is that you group people together. And as I mentioned before, the costs for litigation are extremely high, but if you divide it by 1 million people, suddenly they are a couple of cents per person. And that actually allows access to justice that we didn't have so far in this field. And that could actually change a lot of these things. We did a bit of a test run in Austria years ago with basically an online app where people could sign up with Facebook so that we actually knew they really have an account. And we even used all the APIs that they have to kind of prove that these violations really happened. And within a couple of days, we had 25,000 people that joined that. And I was able to manage that from my private laptop. So there is options of enforcement that will come out of that may change some of the dynamic in the background. A lot of that is going to go back to the Court of Justice, and we're really kind of awaiting a lot of judgments on that where we can find out how this works in practice. But in reality, that may be a new angle to the nothing ever happens anyways discussion that we're looking into. So a lot of new steps and a lot of things that we'll have to do in the future, but I hope that this overview was useful to you all. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Max. I think we can definitely agree that privacy can be engaging, even if I think that most people don't care at all about it. So thank you for providing really great context and also like your personal story, which is very inspiring. But I would like to dig deeper into the future. So we spoke about the context, we spoke about some of the kind of privacy culture and the privacy issues. But I would like to get your thoughts on what good looks like, actually. You know, we've had Schrems I, we've had Schrems II, maybe Schrems 3, 4, 5, depending on how optimistic you are.
Yeah, so to keep it on, like to maybe stay with the data transfer discussion, it's interesting because it depends on the sector where you're at. In some sectors, it's what people are most interested in, but it's literally, I think, 3-4% of our work. So we do tons of other stuff to data transfers. On the data transfers itself, the new deal is basically the Privacy Shield second time around. There are some additional decorative elements, so to say, in the system. But bottom line, if you really do the comparison, you have this new executive order that the European Commission relies on in the US, but that's largely a copy-paste from the old PPD 28 that no one has ever read. So even at lawyer conferences when I'm like how many people have actually read the new executive order and the old one, hardly anybody ever raises their hands. I usually ask that question after saying how many people advise clients on that, and the hands are much more than the people actually reading any of these laws. But I think there is very little room to win that. On our side, we had a capacity issue to bring it, to be frank. A lot of that is just loads of work. And to a certain extent, my interest in it personally also got less and less, because what is the Court of Justice going to say? Probably the same thing a third time around. And I think one part that in the privacy bubble may not be that much discussed is the dynamics at the Court of Justice. Because in both cases, it was really that the judges have said, you know, we're now under the Lisbon Treaty, so since 2008, we're not a commercial court anymore, we are a constitutional court now. And it's these first cases of data retention, Data Rights Ireland, and so on, where they could actually play that card for the first time. And to a certain extent, these discussions were a matter of authority. So the European Commission was like, oh, that's diplomacy, that's our role, and you shouldn't intervene with that. And the Court of Justice was like, you're breaking fundamental rights. That's our role to stop you here. And I think for the dynamics of the kind of constitutional fabric of the EU, it's going to be very hard for the Court of Justice to just give up. And to say, oh, if you just repeat the same thing 3 or 4 times, we're just going to walk away. That is my kind of addition to just all the privacy reasons why this case probably would be one whenever it's brought in a good way. We're still planning to bring it at some point, but we also have 10,000 other things on the desk. And to be honest, the point was made largely. I think everybody kind of knows that that problem is a problem. And there's tons of other things that are, for us right now, a bit more pressing. And we also lost a bit the window of opportunity, to be honest. Our thinking was to get it out rather quickly. I think by now this kind of urgency feeling is a bit gone as well, and then it's a matter of, oh, if we do it next half a year, it's not going to make much of a difference than doing it now.
So maybe just to speculate a little bit, where do you think actually the solution to that problem might come from? Because right now it's a discussion really within the EU and so on. But is that a question of, should that actually just put more pressure on the US? How do we...
So I think the dynamic of this is really interesting. And what I touched upon before is how can we unify and how can we get like a baseline agreement to kind of not have stops to data transfers. I'm personally much of a globalist, so I'm sometimes unhappy to be the name that's used to kind of sectorize stuff. The really interesting dynamic that has changed is that the US is getting some of that heat now as well from China. So this like, what's your worry is a bit hard if like 2 seconds later you're trying to block TikTok and you block Huawei for like 5G bases and so on. So this idea of, oh, where does our data go and are we really happy with that is now also got some traction on the US end. What's really interesting is as much as there's disagreement maybe on the commercial use of personal data, the government use of personal data, we actually agree. And to be honest, the Fourth Amendment is stricter than a lot of the EU law when it comes to government surveillance. We are much more flexible when it comes to government surveillance than the US is. The big difference here is not the level of privacy versus the government. The big difference is, are you a second-class person if you're not a US citizen? Because the Fourth Amendment only applies to US citizens and not to foreigners. And that is where I think the interesting part comes in, is to say, we actually agree how far governments should reach into your privacy. Can we get an agreement among democratic countries to say we do have some free flow of data, but a certain limitation or like a recognition that all of our citizens have some rights? It becomes even more complex because in the EU we have the approach of human rights, not citizens' rights. So also a Chinese person or an Indian person living here has exactly the same rights as a European. So we would need to get towards like some type of human rights approach so that it would ever work with the European system. And I think that's, however, doable, because there's nothing inherently more interesting about a foreigner than your national citizens. We know that a lot of the terrorism and whatever is brought up is by now homegrown and not really imported. So I think that is something where if reasonable people get together at some point, and if there's some, usually it's a big scandal, it's some big situation where it all boils up again, where everybody suddenly has that urge of fixing it, that could be there. Our hopes was that if the European Commission would not have a new deal, if the data protection authorities actually would enforce something, that would get big tech in the US moving and basically walk to Congress and say, guys, we're having a hard time, because what the US is trying to do is to say, give us all the data of the whole world. We're the cloud provider for the whole world. That's our big industry. Now where Boeing is not flying anymore, let's do that. And basically tell people it's all going to be here. But at the same time, not giving any rights to foreigners. And that's a bit of a hard proposition. I usually joke and say it's a bit like Switzerland saying, give us all your gold, but there's no property rights for foreigners. I don't think too many rich people would be interested in having their gold in Switzerland anymore. But when it comes to privacy and data usage, that is kind of right now the reality of the US proposition, not because of the industry wanting that, but because of how the laws go together and the government laws that are there. And to be frank, most of the industry hates it. They're not overly interested in helping the NSA to spy on people. But that's just how the law is. And I think there would be a proposition within the US to say, guys, if we want to sell our products long run, talking about the next 20, 30, or 40 years, globally, we must fix that problem somehow. Because it's, to add to that, it's not only a privacy issue. US law talks about any data. It can also be company secrets. It can be wherever they found the new, oil option or gas option or whatever, like all of these things, a normal company would probably be like, am I really comfortable that my data goes somewhere where, if there's a new administration, if there is some crisis or whatever, suddenly they could tap into all of that without any judge ever approving it. And I think that is where, on the one hand, the US realizes that heat a bit more as well, because they start to be on the receiving end of this a bit more with China. And at the same time, there is a proposition to be made to say, actually, we agree on how far government surveillance goes. And let's just agree that we have that vice versa, and data can then flow freely. That's our hopes, but that is more of a hopes that maybe when I'm around pension age, we could actually get there. But I think that is the long run, the long-term solution that we think of.
But I'd like to follow on that dynamics, kind of global versus local. Because even in the context of the data sharing, tech people focus on the cloud. We had the whole kind of cloud revolution. But now in response to some of the legislation, also, of course, kind of nation-state security and so on, you see those sovereign clouds popping up. And on the one hand, people argue, okay, this is about sovereignty, this is about security. On the other hand, the critiques that say, listen, like we are sacrificing the ease of use and flexibility, we're creating silos between countries and regions. How do you think we should approach that? How do we balance the two? Do we even care about balancing that?
Go very back to what was in the presentation is, bottom line is different cultures. And we then have democracies that ideally put that culture into law at some point. And let's zoom out of just a privacy discussion. We have discussions about freedom of speech, how far that should go, how far hate speech should go, disinformation, and so on. So there's larger topics than just a privacy topic and national security, where we fundamentally disagree. Like where just traditionally there's different views on that. In Austria, denying the Holocaust will always be a crime, even though it's not a realistic big problem, to be honest. Like we have major different problems on the right-wing sphere than that. But that's not going to go away. At the same time, that would always be something that is perceived freedom of speech in the US, and that's not going to go away. So we'll have tons of these questions where we traditionally, if we look out of the privacy sphere, how we solve that, we either really had silos, where we said, okay, there is a boundary, and then there is a check at the border, and that's how we say there is rule A on this side and rule B on the other side of the line. That's one option. Or we started having international agreements and said, okay, let's level up, let's have a common understanding of this. Let's all kind of, go a little bit towards the other side. And then we can have the free flow of, product, services, and in this case, data. I think that is where, in reality, some of this truth lies. And that's a political decision. Like, I'm a lawyer here. I basically say that's what the law says right now. But it's bottom line a political decision where we want to go. If we think about the current situation, we are moving towards a much more nationalized approach the last 10 years. And I think in reality, that's probably going to stick around for a bit. I'm not a big fan, I have to say. But just to kind of, for planning reasons, to a certain extent, we have to say that's going to be the reality. And also in privacy, we're kind of, or in the data sphere, we're used to this kind of like one global thing where everything goes around. I think hopefully we can at least get larger clusters, because talking about freedom of speech, that's still different in each EU member state. Like if you have discussions about how you should regulate your platform, good luck with the different regulations in all the EU member states. And I think the clusters would be a part where we could realistically achieve something and get commerce going without having these barriers. And then in the longer run, really think about at least a, let's say, democratic union of countries. We're not going to agree with that with China or Russia. I think that ship has sailed. And then to a certain extent, there will be some things of that being nationalized. Just to zoom out of the privacy discussion, we had these discussions about having a free trade agreement with the US in general, where, for example, the chlorinated chicken was the big issue. Like, literally, we do not have a trade deal because they could put chlorine on their chicken and we don't do that, and that's the reason we don't have a trade deal. So there is much more trivial discussions in other areas to stop trade than in the privacy area or in the data area. We're just coming from another end. We're coming from the everything flows end. They come from a nothing ever goes end, and we may in our sphere feel more nationalization or more regionalization. while in other spheres that's totally normal. Like we negotiate for 20 years about like a trade deal with Mercosur, the South American countries, and can't agree because of like, how they, I don't know, treat their cattle or something. I'm sure there are reasons for that, but if you compare it to all our data is directly going to the NSA, maybe not that much of an issue, at least in my world. And I think that is something where we also have to kind of put that in perspective compared to other areas. It's just that we're moving a different direction than others.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. But I'd like to move away maybe from kind of the discussion around the kind of cross-border data sharing. We spoke about the cloud. There was a cloud revolution, which now seems to be like from a few decades ago, and everyone is kind of hyped and with all the buzz around AI. And of course, none of your business is also now starting to get involved with some of those discussions, with some of the lawsuits. How do you think about this? Do you even think that LLMs can ever be GDPR compliant?
Yes and no. So first big disclaimer, I'm not an AI expert. I know everybody's now an AI expert. I officially say I'm not. What we do is that we apply the GDPR as it is to that system. And the GDPR is tech neutral, so it allows you to use the law with a new technology as well. And the AI Act, for example, says whenever it comes to personal data, the GDPR rules, I'm not ruling this. So what we started doing so far is dicing it up into different stages. So if you have traditional GDPR appliance, you have processing steps, and each processing step you can dice up. And that way you can say, okay, for this element, we actually don't have personal data, so we can do that. Then this step, we actually have that prom and so on. So what we dealt with so far the most was actually the kind of training phase, where there is largely the big tech companies saying, oh, we have legitimate interest to just suck up the data of everybody. Not sure if that's going to fly. The discussion there is really very much open. What the European Data Protection Board has like blinked towards is to say, if you kind of ingest a shitload of data where there may be some personal data in it without really wanting it, because you, I don't know, have news articles where there's just some name in it, then do whatever you can do to get rid of these names, because in reality you probably don't need that anyways for training purposes. Then you may have a legitimate interest. And that goes a little bit, there was Google Spain way back when as a decision where Google basically scrapes the whole internet as well for search purposes. And already back then they said just making money with it for Google is not a legitimate interest. Google itself cannot scrape the internet. They can scrape it for the information interests of their users as a fundamental right. So that was the way that the Court of Justice reacted to that back then. And probably for AI we'll have a similar situation where it also needs to be necessary for all of these legal bases. You always have to prove, I really need that data, can I not do it any other way? And that is exactly for the purpose of your conference, something where probably very little code can already solve the problem. We have luckily 3 developers in our own organization. So some of these things are really like, oh, we can just take these 1 or 2 things out and legally that makes a big difference. I think there is a lot of potential on that part. This other end where we actually worked on so far was kind of the output side where we realized that a lot of the, what's really interesting from a GDPR perspective is data has to be accurate if it comes to individual people. All of this, again, if it's AI and it's not about personal data, do whatever you want to do. GDPR does not concern you. When you actually use it on personal data, then the accuracy principle gets in your way, because if we have all these kind of crazy results, anybody can sue you to say, oh, you generated some wrong information about me, or we have that now with credit ranking where they start to do that. And oftentimes people are concerned, did I get rejected for a credit, which is what they realize. But they oftentimes don't realize that they had a risk premium because some calculation in the background went wrong. No one understands that because all the banks go to the same credit reporting bureau in the background, and suddenly one person always has 0.5% more in all their offers. Now, if you buy a house and 0.5% more is in all your offers, you pay a shitload of money over the next 10 or 20 years just because something may have gone wrong in the background. And I think that is all the cases that may come up in the future where, it's really about bigger amounts where people may actually sue and say, your algorithm was not accurate in this and that part, and I have a right that is accurate, and if not, you are liable for it. And that is under GDPR, but to be honest, also under a lot of other laws that we have that I'm not an expert on, but this idea you usually find in the law a lot. So there are elements where right now it may not be ready to actually be used. And there are elements, especially talking about how to solve it technically, We, for example, get the answer right now that you cannot have a right to access to it, that you cannot correct it because that's how the system works. But it's really interesting to see how can we fine-tune algorithm and thereby have the right to rectification and rectify this wrong information in the system, or how much can we put a filter at least to kind of filter out systematic wrong answers that we know of, or how much can we at least have lists of where the data came from, so that later I can give a right to access and say, okay, that is actually where we scraped that data that now is in the output later. So there is room for that, and I think some of that is rather simple even. And then there's the really tricky parts of rectification, deletion, and so on that you must do under the GDPR that, from a technical point, may be more complicated, but other people know more about that than me.
We will have some talks actually tomorrow on that, on like removing the personally identifiable information from LLMs, and I think my understanding is that it's like almost close to impossible. And I wanted to just as the final question, so you mentioned you have developers also in none of your business, and of course we spoke about kind of the difficulties working with LLMs, but let's assume, again, be optimistic that we can train them without exposing any personal information, without them leaking that information. Can this be actually useful? Can this be useful kind of to reverse the logic here for privacy? So what I mean by this, you spoke about, for example, different data protection, Irish Data Protection Commission being massively under-resourced, and this is always...
Oh, they're not. They're perfectly resourced. They have more people than in Spain or something.
But like other data commissions or the data protection commissions, we have also like the burden of a lot of that is on small businesses that simply don't have the same resources as the big tech. Can they actually, do you think that it would be probably naive to think that some of those technologies that don't want to introduce the problems can actually be useful in the long term?
I think, we are already ourselves experimenting with that because we do like summaries of judgments where really like there's no point in a human doing that if the system works. So far, to be honest, we see it a bit overhyped. I think the next generation in 2 or 3 years may actually get us to the results that are right now in the promotional material, but we're definitely going to get there. So there are parts where for us, being the perfect example of an SME, we're 25 people, this really gives you access to tools that you would otherwise not have as a small organization and allows a lot of these options, and I think that's really interesting. We obviously would run that on-prem and have all the bells and whistles of privacy attached to it. And I think what's really interesting in our side at least is to think about where is it useful and where not. So for example, for us, processing input data that we get and digesting that is a really interesting part. Writing a complaint with AI over my dead body because what I saw so far is just not really useful, but you can combine it, for example. So we work a lot with text blocks that are approved by the lawyers, and we could then have a system where the other side is read with an LLM model and then triggers different text blocks that we approved and signed off on. And that can be a combination where we get good quality out and feel comfortable with it. While still not needing someone to actually sit there for a whole day to read it and write it. And I think that is the stuff that we're looking into, for example. And that can really shift a lot of the dynamics, especially if there's open source models, if there's models that can be developed further and are not, these. And we're not going into a world where we have 2 or 3 big models that are basically just available through an API, and we all then have to shift our money to another big tech company to get that service.
Thanks, Max. I think we're short on time, so thank you again for a wonderful presentation, for the conversation, and looking forward also to the panel that you'll be on tomorrow, I believe. And I will now pass on over to Peter, but before that, let's thank Max again.
Thanks a lot.